Raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass, pull up a chair, and we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub. Whether you are a secret agent, a spy, or a solitaire player, always glad to be here with you guys. Jason and James, I am Micah. How we doing, fellas? Your back still hurting from out there working in the dirt in South Carolina?
Well, I'll tell you, it was a blast being down there. I'm feeling much better. Getting some fresh air, although cold as it might have been. I think we all had a good time. A little bit sore in the shoulders and lower back, but feeling much better now. Wouldn't have traded that experience for anything.
I learned that I like archaeological field work quite a bit, actually. And then I reconfirmed something to myself, which is I don't really like cold weather that much.
Yeah, you don't expect when you're going to be doing archaeological field excavations in Columbia, South Carolina in March that it's going to be in the 30s with a wind chill factor much lower than that. And frankly, it was quite miserable temperature-wise a couple of those mornings. But yeah, people who are wondering what we were doing, we can't give out all the details, of course. We don't want to attract too much attention to the location, but we can tell you this much, that we were involved in a archaeological dig that was being conducted by our good friend Dr. Chris Moore, and this, of course, in association with the South Carolina educational system. And this particular site, which I'm sure Jason will be giving us some more information about, he actually spent a little bit more time down there. He stuck around through the end of the week. James and I, we had to take off Thursday evening, but we were able to spend a lot of time on site with Chris and the crew. We had some of the South Carolina DNR and a representation there, a lot of volunteers, a lot of grad students, and then the Seven Ages team getting out there and doing the back-breaking digging, which is really what's so fun about it. And in fact, if you don't follow us already on Instagram and you'd like to see some pictures from this escapade, just head over there to Instagram, Seven Ages Research. You can see me shoveling dirt into a sifter that Jason's working. There's some great pictures of James and I down there in one of the trenches actually digging, and there were some discoveries that were made during the time that we were down there.
Yeah, I mean, it was an all-around great experience. I mean, it was, of course, done with the utmost scientific discipline. Got to meet a lot of good people, a lot of people we really didn't even know were going to be there. So, again, you never know when we do these excavations and road trips and all the various things that we do here at Seven Ages, who we're going to run into. But we ended up meeting a whole plethora of great scientists, geologists, archaeologists. There was a whole team of different disciplines out there all working together toward a common goal. So, yeah, this particular site is located in the central part of the state of South Carolina. There's a lot of data to be gleaned from this particular site, not just archaeologically, but a lot of things that have to do with paleoclimates and various types of information that can help build a picture for these early people here in North America. So, as much as we enjoyed the actual digging, which is something I always enjoy, I just enjoy being out in that environment and being part of a team. It was the after conversations that, always lead to new discoveries and building of knowledge. So we had an opportunity to spend some time with Dr. Chris Moore, Chris Young, some of the other people that were part of the team, build some relationships there with those folks and just have some great conversation after the workday had ended.
For me, there was a lot of things. I got to meet Chris Moore. I got to meet Dr. Goodyear. I brought that point that my neighbor had loaned me that I thought was an unfluted Clovis point, and Dr. Goodyear was able to analyze it and put its information in the Paleo-Indian database, and it turns out it was actually a redstone, which is even more rare. When I brought it back and I gave the documentation to my neighbor, he was really, really tickled about it and was really happy that he had loaned it out to us to take up there and get analyzed. And the other thing that I learned, which I didn't know, I probably could have suspected maybe, but is that archaeologists and geologists are very much alike when it comes to socializing. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of socializing that occurred, like Jason said, after hours, and just being able to compare notes and share. And actually, that has continued. I know that, Jason, you're normally in touch with Dr. Chris Moore, and I've really enjoyed our ongoing dialogue, too. And he had sent me a number of his papers and things to review, which I've really enjoyed reading. I think that was a real eye-opener for us. What I consider to be very conclusive data that he presents, suggesting the lacustrine formation of the Carolina Bays, long considered to be impact areas, and some maintain that. And there is still quite a bit of dialogue going back and forth between the two groups. But again, Chris gave us a pretty compelling argument for the natural lake formation of these sites. And of course, you mentioned, James, Dr. Albert Goodyear, again, a good friend of ours and a fellow who took so much time with us over the course of the week that we were down there, not only there at the site that we were working, but as we will be discussing in future editions of this program, far more in depth. He took us out to the famous Topper site, and to be standing in the pre-Clovis strata at that remarkable archaeological site with Dr. Goodyear, who carried out and led those excavations there, and to understand the importance of that. And having looked at the lithic samples that were retrieved from that site, which to me, once you stand there with Dr. Goodyear and he shows you the evidence of flaking and the evidence of human action, I think it's, in my personal opinion, irrefutably evidence of not only a pre-Clovis presence there in that part of South Carolina, but also of a much earlier presence than many in the archaeological community maintained. We, at some point, maybe we'll get a little time to talk about this, but there was the recent letter to Science Mag, and it had been co-authored by Vance Haynes and Vance Holliday and a number of other real professionals. But, in fact, since we're bringing it up, maybe we can just talk about this briefly here, guys. There's the relevant point from this letter, and I just want to read this. The letter is primarily a refutation of an article that appeared in the November 2017 edition. Finding the First Americans was the title of this. And I'm going to read from the co-authored letter. It says, contrary to Brage et al., genetic evidence indicates that Native American ancestors diverged from Siberian populations 24,009 to 18,400 years ago, followed by population expansion into the Americas 16,000 to 13,500 years ago. Only two Native American lineages have been identified south of Beringia, a northern lineage constrained to northern North America, and a southern lineage directly linked with Clovis, which they, and I quote, say is the earliest unequivocal widespread cultural manifestation south of the ice sheets. Now, let me just offer some commentary quickly about that before we continue. I actually agree that we can say Clovis maybe is the earliest unequivocal widespread cultural manifestation, and I don't think at this point that they're trying to refute pre-Clovis, nor are they in total trying to do that. I guess that deep reading into this and trying to understand the implications of the language, they are asserting that we don't have any kind of clear cultural designations for the pre-Clovis sites, but we nonetheless know that somebody was there. Okay, so nobody's refuting that or disputing it at this point, but I continue with the letter. Thus, a Native American lineage in the Americas between 25,000 and 15,000 years ago is inconsistent with current data. They say there is no consensus on the validity of purported pre-16,000-year-old sites, which vary in accurate dating, unambiguous artifacts, and clear association between them. Now, that does seem to be taking shots at sites such as Topper, which it is suggested represent locations where archaeological evidence does suggest human presence much earlier than that 16,000-year-old point. But then going on back to the letter, moreover, there are few technological connections among 16,000 to 13,500-year-old pre-Clovis sites, or with later Paleo-Indian artifacts. Thus, the relationships between these sites and later Native Americans remain ambiguous. It's a little unusual to try and understand exactly what the point being made here is, because although they are addressing a paper that was talking about travel at much earlier times over from Beringia, perhaps utilizing watercraft, the statement where they point out again that there are few technological connections among 16,000 and 13,500-year-old pre-Clovis sites, or with later Paleo-Indian artifacts. I get that. I guess that they're saying we don't have direct evidence that Clovis can be linked to whoever was there, but the wording is a little strange because it leaves a lot to the imagination in terms of, well, what exactly are they talking about? We do know, for instance, that we have artifacts in situ, like the Miller Lancelet that was recovered at the famous Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. James Adovazio recovered that. We talked about that in the first episode of the podcast. The question I have is, if we don't directly associate those artifacts with a recognized culture, what are they saying? I mean, for instance, one might posit that you could read from this article that they would at least lend some credence to ideas like even the Solutrean hypothesis. They're obviously not saying that outwardly, but again, we don't know where an artifact like the Miller Lancelet could have come from. Could it have been brought over by a culture from Europe? Could it have been brought over from someone who utilized watercraft and came from Siberia? Could it have been brought up following a northerly path from South America and perhaps one of the inhabitants of Monteverde? Somebody must have been there, and even if we can't make a direct cultural association, we haven't identified a widespread cultural group like Clovis for these pre-Clovis artifacts and the sites where they're found. Nonetheless, you can't dispute the fact that the artifacts have been found, and so I'm just a little confused as to what exactly Ben Potter and Vance Haynes, Vance Holliday, what exactly the scope of this is intended to be. Now, so before I throw it back to you guys, I want to kind of skip ahead to the end of the article. Just to be clear, they cover everything from the primary focus being the migratory routes, and they're disputing the paper aforementioned, but they also talk about pre-Clovis sites and the like, and they conclude saying that Brage et al. Assert that there is near complete agreement among archaeologists on these issues. However, the most recent survey showed that archaeologists are divided, with many thinking that both interior and coastal routes were used, and expressing skepticism about several proposed pre-Clovis sites. Genetic and archaeological data suggests expansion from Siberia into the Americas around 16,000 to 13,500 years ago, consistent with terrestrial and or coastal migrations. This evidence base explains the absence of consensus among scientists regarding both routes and the timing of the peopling of the Americas. Again, maybe en masse, the peopling of the Americas certainly did occur between that 16,000 to 13,005 window. I wonder, again, more specifically, what pre-Clovis sites they're disputing, probably sites like Topper and others. I hope, though, that they're not saying that something like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, with the meticulous nature of the excavations carried out there, that they don't believe that that is evidence of a migration into America, or that at very least somebody was here at the time suggested. And then further, what do we say about sites like Monteverde? As Michael Shermer and others have noted, is it just an anomaly? Or, again, are they trying to refute the idea that what Tom Dillahay found there going back in advance of 30,000 years is archaeologically sound? What do you guys think?
Well, for me, it's nothing new under the sun. I mean, this argument has been going on forever. I mean, this is decades old at this point. Every year, there seems to be one of these papers that comes out that says, it is or it isn't, or these pre-Clovis sites are legitimate or they're not. Again, this is an ongoing issue that seems to be readdressed at least every couple of years. My concern, however, is, like you mentioned, we do have sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter that's conservatively dated to 15,000 BP, and that's the conservative estimate. Monteverde, we're looking at 14,500 all the way back potentially to 38,000 years BP, as described by Tom Dillahay. And then other sites like Cactus Hill at 22,000 to 18,500 BP, the Page Ladson site that we recently discussed down in Florida. So in my mind, there's no shortage of these potential pre-Clovis sites. So, again, you're always going to have two sides, two teams, both looking at it through different lenses. And you have gradualists who believe that this happened very slowly. You have people who still at this date and time prescribe to things like the overkill hypothesis for the explanation of the extinction of the megafauna. So again, this is, ongoing. I don't see anything to dispute what we have as far as the dating now. So, and you also have to look at the authors of who, produced this particular report, because they are known to fall into that one particular camp.
Right.
Yeah. And to call, a place like Monteverde an anomaly, or any place like this an anomaly, is really sort of an injustice to science my way. Because the way I think about these things is they're not an anomaly, they're a data point. And a data point is a piece of a larger puzzle. So to exclude that data because you don't like the way it fits, or you don't know where it fits, is not really a very scientific way to go about things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, they, of course, do cite their sources. I would like to see what citation number 12 entails, though, which is the, quote, most recent survey that they cite, in which there is skepticism proposed in relation to some of the pre-Clovis sites and things. Look, I mean, I get it. maybe not every proposed pre-Clovis site is irrefutably evidence of a much earlier habitation in North America prior to Clovis. We do know one thing, though, that there were people here before the cultural designation we recognize through lithic technology and fluted blades as Clovis. And we also know that the lithic representation prior to the Clovis horizon is distinctly dissimilar from Clovis. There is no fluting present. There are some lithic types, and folks, again, when we talk about lithics, we're essentially just meaning stone tools, and more specifically points, spear points, knives, arrowheads that are recognized in cultural association in terms of time and space with different groups. And this helps us kind of gauge the interdigitation, I think, as Dr. Jim Adavagio would like to say. But again, what we're really looking at is the historic lineage and datable periods during which these stone tools were used. When we look at these kind of things, I mean, whatever was prior to Clovis is very different from Clovis. And this is what's led to this whole hoopla with, again, Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley, and this documentary that very controversially aired and was in support of the so-called Solutrean hypothesis. Again, without endorsing a Solutrean origin for Clovis, which is certainly problematic genetically and otherwise, it's not all that far out, at least, to say that perhaps people from, Paleolithic European hunters did make it across Atlantic ice, to paraphrase the title of their book, and that they may have made it over into the northeastern United States, and that they at very least hunted. And as Dr. Al Goodyear describes these things, they could have been failed migrations. They weren't intended. I mean, these ancient Paleolithic hunters weren't going around going, well, guys, I guess we're going to do a migration next week, so let's get the team together and head on over. I mean, it's never probably planned out that way. They were going wherever they could, wherever the food supply led them. It's not unusual or impossible that they might have made their way to the northeastern coast of the United States, but again, the idea that if that is politically or otherwise seemingly problematic, that you would dispute the archaeological evidence in the face of that you would say, well, I don't like the idea or what it entails, therefore I choose not to look at this evidence, that is extremely problematic for science.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned just a few minutes ago was, they cite a survey. The most recent survey of the archaeological community says this, and you see this a lot in science, especially in sort of politicized sciences, where they'll say, well, we surveyed, the so-and-so community, and, the feeling is this. And they cite that as a type of evidence as against your theory or against your hypothesis, which really, to me, that's one of those things where it's like, well, everybody says you're wrong and nobody likes you, so therefore your theory does not hold water. And that's just an argument that you make when you don't really have an argument.
Let me share one quick quote from a guy who I have a lot of respect for, the late Marcello Truzzi. He was the founder of a publication called the Zetetic Scholar, but he was also a prominent skeptic who kind of parted ways from the skeptic movement because of some of the attitudes that he saw in it. And I have a quote from him. He says, "In science, the burden of proof falls upon the claimant, and the more extraordinary a claim, the heavier is the burden of proof demanded. The true skeptic takes an agnostic position, one that says the claim is not proved rather than disproved. He asserts that the claimant has not borne the burden of proof, and that science must continue to build its cognitive map of reality without incorporating the extraordinary claim as a new quote-unquote fact. Now, since the true skeptic does not assert a claim, he has no burden to prove anything. He just goes on using the established theories of conventional science as usual. But if a critic asserts that there is evidence for disproof, that he has a negative hypothesis, saying, for instance, that a seeming psi result, and he was talking about psychic phenomena in this example, was actually due to an artifact, he is making a claim and therefore also has to bear a burden of proof. He said both critics and proponents need to learn to think of adjudication in science as more like that found in the law courts, imperfect and with varying degrees of proof and evidence. Absolute truth, like absolute justice, is seldom attainable. We can only do our best to approximate them." And he had a term for, and I'm not asserting that anyone we're discussing or that, we're not pointing the finger, and we're certainly not going to label somebody a pseudo-skeptic, but Truzzi had this delineation for what he would call a pseudo-skeptic and labeled their actions and their activities as follows. He said that 1, denying when only doubt has been established. Also, double standards in the application of criticism. 3, the tendency to discredit rather than investigate. 4, presenting insufficient evidence or proof themselves. 5, assuming criticism requires no burden of proof. That's a big one. Number 6, making unsubstantiated counterclaims. Number 7, counterclaims based on plausibility rather than empirical evidence. And finally, number 8, he says, suggesting that unconvincing evidence provides grounds for completely dismissing a claim. And these things all in contrast to what he called true skepticism. I mean, skepticism is fundamental to science. And we heard Dr. Goodyear saying that over the course of the week while we were down there. I do worry, though, sometimes that in the face of evidence of something, whether or not there's consensus on it, there are some people who are purely denialist rather than being doubtful, which is good skepticism. So anyway, not to rattle on all day about that, but I think that it's very important that as we're seeing this debate unfold and continue, as you said, Jason, in the archaeological community, let's not just downplay or dismiss something that doesn't fall into the category or the narrative that we expect to see. Science is not based on the presupposition of fact. It is based on what evidence leads us to, and we have to remember that sometimes. Something else that we should remember right now, guys, it being episode 007 of the 7 Ages Audio Journal. That's right. The famous secret agent, James Bond. Now that, a rendition of the James Bond theme song being performed by my good friend and two-time national champion banjo player Charles Wood. And often during our live performances, when he and I play together, we actually play the James Bond theme. It's quite funny to hear that played on a banjo, but since we've got a banjo on our theme song, I figured maybe we could get that in there. But that's right, guys, it's 007 Day here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. I know you guys are big James Bond fans. James?
Yeah, I've always been a big James Bond fan. I like all the films. They all have their certain character about them, and even the newer films, I actually especially like those because they're a little edgier, and liked all the James Bonds. I know you guys probably have your favorite James Bonds, maybe Roger Moore or whoever.
Hold on. Is anybody's favorite James Bond Roger Moore?
It actually is mine.
There we go.
Here it starts. Well, you know, actually, I liked Roger Moore. I liked all the James Bonds. It's kind of like with Doctor Who. I like all the Doctors. Well, I guess I should say I like almost everyone who has performed in the role of James Bond. I think we all have our favorites. Mine, of course, is probably Sean Connery. He was the perennial favorite because he was the first actor to portray the role in films like Dr. No. In fact, I actually saw recently, guys, that there is a poster from the film Thunderball, and they are saying that it's expected that this thing is going to bring in $10,000 at an auction. I mean, the lasting appeal of James Bond is undeniable. Jason, who's your favorite actor to have portrayed the role?
Well, you know, I think everybody kind of has that connection with Sean Connery just because he did it so well. I think the first Bond I actually remember seeing was probably Timothy Dalton, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe Pierce Brosnan. But I think, you know, actually, I think Daniel Craig has done a fantastic job with the character. Now, he's, you know, been around a good bit longer than some of the other Bonds, so you've kind of gotten used to seeing him playing that role. But he kind of brought a new perspective to it, kind of, you know, the updated Bond that we see, a little bit different personality, a little bit different way of portraying the character. But that's what's so great about the Bond is the Bond role, that is everybody kind of takes their own shot at it and gives it their own personality. Sean Connery was the very suave and, you know, kind of had that feel to it, where Daniel Craig is more of the, I guess you would say, action star who kind of takes it to the next level as far as that goes. Overall, my favorite, though, everybody, I think, kind of has some degree of love for the Sean Connery role, but Timothy Dalton, I believe, was the first Bond that I ever saw.
You know, that's interesting because he didn't portray Bond in as many films as the other actors that would do so over the years, but there was an original piece of artwork that was commissioned by Ian Fleming when they were going to be running a series of little comic strips, I believe, in the Daily Mail, keeping in mind, of course, that Fleming worked as a newspaper writer for a number of years after the war. And the comic art that was commissioned, if you go to the Wikipedia page for James Bond, you'll actually see this image. And many Bond historians and critics and the like have noted over the years that Timothy Dalton most closely resembled the actual commissioned artwork that Fleming had for James Bond. And so while he may not be the most memorable actor to have portrayed James Bond, he nonetheless probably fits the physical appearance most closely. And in the drawing, you'll note that James Bond has the characteristic scar on his cheek, which in the novels Fleming described him as having, whereas in the films, James Bond doesn't have that. Despite, for instance, the rugged appearance and the persona that actor Daniel Craig brings to the role, they haven't carried over that scar and other defining characteristics that are featured in the novels. But, of the novels, I got to say that the very first one, it wasn't exactly well received at the time of its publication, but Casino Royale, very interesting book, and still one of my favorite Bond novels, because so many elements of history are represented in that book. And by that I mean that during his time in the war, we have Ian Fleming, Ian Lancaster Fleming, Agent 17F. He's the assistant to the director of MI5, Charles Maxwell Knight, who had been, of course, the inspiration for M. But we have a lot of interesting esoteric tie-ins. The owner of the Cavendish Hotel had said that while the famed occultist Aleister Crowley resided on Germain Street, that he and Fleming would meet at the Cavendish Hotel for dinner very frequently. And it's also mentioned in Charles Maxwell Knight's biography, The Man Who Was M, that he and a number of his associates were very interested in occultism, and that they had correspondence with and had met Aleister Crowley prior to the war. And so there are a lot of really interesting stories, but in one of the biographies of Fleming that I own, which is called 17F, and it was written by Donald McCormick, who had been a co-author, or rather a fellow writer for, I believe, the Daily Mail at the time where Fleming worked there. There's an entire chapter in that book that's rather bizarre, and I call into question some of what's written in this particular biography, but the story goes, based on the testimony given by an alleged illegitimate child of Aleister Crowley, that Fleming and Maxwell Knight appealed to Crowley to assist them in trying to utilize occult magic to help them win the war. And now this isn't necessarily disputed that Aleister Crowley may have assisted, and that there was indeed exploitation of the Nazis' interest in occultism in order to help gain an edge. There were things like fake horoscopes that were being produced. And I believe Elick Howe, being one of the great experts on this, who is cited. We have an article about this at 7ages.org, in fact, too, that discusses how the occultists might have won the war. But it's very interesting because, according to the testimony of this alleged son of Aleister Crowley named Amato Crowley, as told to Donald McCormick in this book, he says that he witnessed a ritual in Ashdown Forest, which had been the basis for the 100-Acre Wood in the Winnie the Pooh stories. He says that he observed a effigy ritual in which Rudolf Hess was burned, and that Maxwell Knight, Ian Fleming, and that Crowley, the three of them, participated. Now, it seems highly suspect. I would call the veracity of that narrative into question, but it's interesting nonetheless. We do know that there is record of a note that had been sent to MI5 after Rudolf Hess made his famous flight to Scotland, crash-landed, was held hostage by a farmer at Pitchfork End literally throughout the night, and then he was captured by the Brits and then taken in for interrogation. There is apparently a note that exists that shows that Aleister Crowley attempted to contact MI5 and said that he would be willing to assist with the interrogation, but that they didn't take him up on that. Nonetheless, that Crowley and Ian Fleming connection is evident in Casino Royale, because the character Le Chiffre, the infamous villain, although Mads Mikkelsen's portrayal in the more recent film is this suave character with black hair, the actual description is of a man in his late 30s, early 40s, somewhat heavy-set, bald. They say that his eyes are very wide and that you could see the whites around them when he stared at you, and he had a propensity for calling people dear boy. Le Chiffre is basically Aleister Crowley, as Ian Fleming would have known him. And it's really interesting seeing the way that those characters carry over from Ian Fleming's life and the people that he knew, some of them nefarious and infamous to history, and the way that they were portrayed in the novels of James Bond. Fascinating stuff to me.
Well, one thing about the James Bond franchise is that it plays on a lot of that early bizarre history of the characters. Ian Fleming himself, as you just described, was a character amongst himself. Very interesting guy if you just focus on Ian Fleming without even looking at the James Bond franchise. He himself is quite the case study for developing what he did with this particular character, James Bond 007. Surrounding this franchise, not only is there tons of history and esoterica and different things like that, but you have so much within the films themselves. If you were to go ask the average person on the street, they would say, who was the first James Bond? And usually somebody will tell you Sean Connery. Well, that's what most people think. But actually, in early 1954, Ian Fleming was paid $1,000 for the television rights for Casino Royale that you just mentioned. So that particular novel was adopted into a 1 hour long TV special that was broadcast back in 1954 on CBS on an episode of the Climax Mystery Theater. So most people don't realize that Barry Nelson in 1954 was actually the first person on television or film to play the James Bond character, not Sean Connery. We don't see Sean Connery until, 1962, I believe?
Yeah, with Dr. No.
Speaking of Dr. No, so from Dr. No to the Quantum of Solace, any guesses on how many people James Bond has killed?
I wouldn't want to have to try and guess.
So the stats from Ye Olde Internet tell us 352 people were killed between those two franchise movies. And also, James Bond happened to sleep with 52 women.
Which is one of the big issues, of course, that moving forward, we've got the final James Bond film with Daniel Craig. Director Danny Boyle, by the way, is expected to direct this, and people are saying this could go any number of different ways. But one thing that is expected is that they're hoping to soften the tone of Bond's character in response to the concerns over the misogynistic nature. And again, what we see is there's been a lot of cultural change over the years since the creation of the character and his arrival in films, and of course, in modern times with things like the notable #MeToo movement and whatnot. These things are going to affect the portrayal of these roles in Hollywood. And so it's going to be interesting to see the final representation of a character like James Bond under Daniel Craig, because despite his rough and rugged exterior and his portrayal of the character in the role, during interviews, Daniel Craig himself has referred to Bond as a misogynist. He seems to have a certain disdain for the character. And in some ways, I would even liken their relationship, that is, Craig and his portrayal of James Bond, to Jeremy Brett in portraying Sherlock Holmes in the Granada television series from the 1980s and 90s. Fantastic representation, arguably the best of the famous sleuth Sherlock Holmes. But he said that, Holmes would come to him in dreams, and that he felt like there was almost this kind of a struggle that he had between his personal, real self and the character he portrayed. I see a bit of that with Daniel Craig, as perceiving Bond as this misogynist and trying to be a guy who doesn't want to be typecast in real life for the role he's played.
That makes sense to me, especially in light, today's political climate. And shift gears a little bit. One of the things that's always been entertaining to me about the Bond franchise is just the names of the movies.
Well, again, the origin of the names of some of the films, Fleming himself, and again, we have to understand, since we discuss history on this podcast, that in terms of the historical context of James Bond, attitudes have changed a lot. And Fleming himself had said at one time that the average James Bond reader, in terms of the effect a James Bond novel was intended to have, Fleming said that he hoped it would strike them someplace between the solar plexus and the upper thigh. And so there's always been this very sexual connotation and a lot of innuendo in the films. Sean Connery particularly was best known, I think, for the quips and the like, but you really see it in all the James Bond films. I'll just never forget, though, one of my favorite Bond sequences actually had been where Connery has a harpoon gun, and this guy comes out from behind a tree and tries to assail him, and he shoots him with the harpoon gun and nails the guy to the tree and says, "I think you got the point." And Connery, I think that goes beyond James Bond for Sean Connery as far as being a guy he's known for a number of memorable quotes and his ability to deliver them.
The one-liners.
He's well known for the one-liners. So anyway, we remember on this episode 007, the world's most famous fictitious spy on the Seven Ages audio journal. It's been a few weeks here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal since we featured any input from our listeners, and I'd like to get to one of our messages right now. Sean Wick writes to us. He says, "Dear Jason, Micah, and James, I heard about Seven Ages on your interview on Into the Fray, as well as the Glacial Report, and right away I was hooked. I've now listened to your 4 podcasts, and they brought me back to a childhood when I would daydream of being a geologist and archaeologist. I think I'm probably too far along in years to start in those fields, but I feel a yearning to be an activist in a way to help preserve sites and objects that link us to the past. I'll explain, but I need to offer somewhat a backstory first. When I was 12, my family and I moved to the Powder River Basin in northeast Wyoming. All around this area are coal mines, and they are what we call open pit mines. And that means that they remove topsoil to get to the coal seams instead of tunneling into the earth like they do in the eastern United States. Now, the subdivision where we lived was set right up against miles and miles of untouched land. My friend and I would explore out there often, and we found some amazing things. We found countless arrowheads as well as remnants of tools. In the center of this region was a pile of rocks that no doubt had been put there by man. This pillar could be seen from miles in every direction, and we assumed it was a marker to help people who once traveled through the area. There were almost hidden remains of old dirt trails, and we assumed all these things were from the Old West time. Then, of course, there was the rock face that we found that was plastered with hundreds of fossilized leaves and insects. Years later, I was heartbroken to find out that the neighboring mine had expanded its operation, and pretty much everything I mentioned above was destroyed. All those amazing things destroyed forever. Jump ahead to today, and I now work at one of those coal mines as a lab tech. A part of me hates representing a multi-billion-dollar corporation that could care less about the relics its machines rip through, and a part of me knows, as a single father, the pay helps provide for my son. In the lab, we often get samples of coal that contain small fractured pieces of amber. I often wonder how big those pieces were before they were taken out of the ground and run through the crushers. I also wonder what amazing things may have been contained within those pieces. There are a lot of fossils in the particular mine, and occasionally one of the miners there will save a piece from being destroyed. Your podcasts have inspired me to consider the disappearing remnants of our past. My question is, what can we do to help preserve these sites and items they contain? How can we possibly stand up against corporations worth billions of dollars? This has also inspired me to seek employment elsewhere. I feel guilty about my participation, as small as it is, in the destruction of things that we can never get back. I may never be an archaeologist as the past me once dreamt of, but I feel I can still make my mark in the field. And so thanks for your time as well as your amazing podcasts, Sean. And Sean, thank you. That was a wonderful email. It's so important to hear from people like yourself because we, the Seven Ages team, are looking for people like you. I met both of these gentlemen through email correspondence. Well, it was Facebook for Jason. You know, he heard that I was going to be in Charleston, South Carolina. We met and became friends. James wrote into me in response to one of my other podcasts. I introduced him to Jason. We all became friends. We found we had a lot in common. We hope over time that there will be more names and faces and people associated professionally and otherwise with our team and who can work with us. And if you would like to send along your ideas, your thoughts, perspectives on things, please email us either at info@sevenages.org, but you can also hit Micah, Jason, or James at sevenages.org, those respective emails, to address any of the 3 team members specifically. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, Sean, well, thank you for writing in. That's really inspirational. And first of all, I'm honored that you feel that way about our podcast, and more so, I'm happy that it's moved you to want to be part of the activism that is so important to the preservation of these sites. One way I would suggest to you to get involved is, first of all, find out your local historical societies. Many times they have volunteer opportunities. Just the Seven Ages team has done. In the last couple of weeks, we often volunteer on archaeological excavations. Oftentimes, these type of excavations really depend upon volunteers to be successful. So check into your local historical preservation societies, look around and see where you can actually get involved yourself. Even, if it's not something physical, they need help in the lab, they need help in the research areas. So there's always some way that you can be a part of this. There's plenty of volunteer opportunities out there. And really that leads into kind of what we're talking about in our interview this week with archaeologist Kurt Sampson. He comes on and discusses a fascinating topic, something that I did not have the knowledge that I should have before, and that's the Wisconsin Effigy Mounds. Kurt really does a lot of exactly what you're talking about in this email. He's an activist, he's an archaeologist, he's a researcher, and more importantly, he's a caretaker for a lot of these effigy mounds They do a lot of volunteer work up there in Wisconsin, cleaning these sites, preserving these sites. Even if it's something on that level, that's something that everybody can go out and be part of.
That's absolutely right, and that's exactly what Kurt does. Now, Kurt Sampson is the director and curator for the Museum of the Dodge County Historical Society. He's a professional archaeologist with Gathering Waters Archaeology, LLC, and former president of the Wisconsin Archaeological Society. He manages the Effigy Mounds Initiative, and he's an expert on woodland period mound building cultures, most specifically effigy mounds, which we'll be discussing with him tonight. Welcome to the program, Kurt.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
Kurt, the mounds that you have there in southern Wisconsin are very, very unique. So if you could just start by giving us a general history of these effigy mounds and just kind of give us an overview of what makes them so special.
Well, effigy mound construction in Wisconsin is a very unique type of late woodland effigy mound construction or burial mound construction. They only occur in this area of the country, primarily focused in south central Wisconsin, a little bit in northern Illinois, a little bit in northeastern Iowa, and just a little bit in southeastern Minnesota. But primarily the heartland of effigy mound construction is in Wisconsin. And this is a late woodland culture that primarily flourished between about 600 AD to right around 1100 to 1200 AD is when the burial mounds for the effigy mound style were primarily constructed. And they're unique in the world. You don't find these type of earthen burial mound constructions anywhere else in the world. And right now in Wisconsin, there are about 3,200 effigy mounds that still remain out of about 40,000 that once existed on the landscape here. And unfortunately, over the last 175 plus years or so, most of the mounds have been destroyed. But we still have about 3,200 effigy mound shapes in the shapes of various animals. And in Wisconsin, we have roughly somewhere between 10 to 11,000 burial mounds as a whole, which include conical and linear type effigy mounds that span about nearly a 3,000-year period of time of mound construction in this area. So even though you have a lot of mound construction in the Ohio River Valley and other parts of the United States, there are more earthen burial mounds in Wisconsin than anywhere else in the world.
Well, that is truly prolific. I mean, that's an incredible amount. I had no idea there was quite that many. The word effigy keeps coming up. Can you give us an idea of what are some of the general effigies that we're seeing? Does there tend to be a trend? Does it seem like there's, the same one repeating, or is it just a wide array?
Well, there are definitely repetition in mound sites. There are about roughly 1,000 individual mound groups in the state of Wisconsin that are comprised of effigies, conical and linear type mounds. The basic forms are primarily bear-shaped mounds, round-shaped conical mounds, which are the most numerous, cigar-shaped linear mounds, and then there are various different types of bird-shaped effigy mounds that have different wing configurations and tail configurations. And then they have, we also have an entire pantheon, if you will, of what we like to refer to as underwater or lower world pantheon mounds, which are referred to as long-tailed panthers in Wisconsin. These are effigy mounds that literally look like giant cats. If you were to look at a cat from the top down on its side, where you would see two legs and a tail that would extend backwards and a head. And many of these mound shapes are meant to represent the cosmological belief system of many different Native American groups in the Upper Great Lakes region. And a lot of the Native American groups in the Upper Great Lakes, Winnebago, Menominee, Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, all these different groups that are in this area, many of them segregate their cosmology or their religious belief system into an upper and lower world tiered universe, so to speak. So you have the birds of the upper world, the bears of the middle world, or our world that we're on now, and then they have this whole other mythological realm of the underworld that's patrolled by the long-tailed panther. So there are mound shapes that represent all of these different upper and lower world connotations. And geographically in the state of Wisconsin, there is some noted geographic differences about how some of these same mound shapes are depicted slightly different on the landscape in different areas of the state of Wisconsin. So for instance, if you're in the state of Wisconsin, we have an area that's called the driftless area, and that's the southwestern part of the state that was not glaciated during the last glacier period during the Wisconsin glaciation. And primarily, the rest of the state has a lot of lakes, rivers, streams, and especially springs. So in the southeastern part of the state, where you have a high concentration of burial mounds, you tend to see geographic distribution of effigy mounds that represent the lower pantheon mounds, like water spears and water panthers, whereas in the southwestern part of the state, where you have a lot of higher bluffs, especially along the Mississippi, into the Wisconsin River Valley and into the Kickapoo River drainage, where you have higher land that has been unglaciated over many centuries, you tend to see a lot more bear and bird mounds in that area. So the ancient people that were building the mounds were definitely using the topography of the land to illustrate their cosmological belief system that they were literally recreating on the landscape.
Yeah, and we seem to see that throughout cultures all over the world, really. And that topography is obviously very important to the development of cultures. I understand that in that region, that the archaeological record shows that these mound building cultures at the time seemed to be isolationists. Can you speak to that a little bit and kind of what evidence shows that?
Well, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think that, you get mound construction beginning in Wisconsin right around the end of what we call the late Archaic, going into the early woodland period, right around about 1000 to 800 BC. And they first started off building very large conical burial mounds, just like the ones that you see in the Ohio River and other parts out east. And I definitely know that there is a cultural transmission of these ideals that are coming from the Ohio River Valley into Wisconsin. And even some people would even argue that maybe it even started in Wisconsin and actually spread to the Ohio River Valley. But you have the effigy mound culture, I guess you could kind of say was an isolationist, maybe manifestation of mound building, just because it was pretty centrally located right in this area. One of the big mysteries, and this is one of the research paradigms or whatever that I'm trying to research over the years, is you have a large middle woodland mound construction period with the Dina and Hopewell cultures in the Ohio River Valley in the Middle Woodland period. And then when that ends about 400 AD or so, shortly after that, you get the rise of the effigy mound culture. Well, one of the things that's not very well understood is what was the impetus of the reason why they started to build effigy mounds and got away from building large geometric earthworks, things of that nature. And one of the things that we think is going on with some recent research is that the carryover, we believe, is in the linear mound construction, because we do have some geometric earthworks in Wisconsin that are very similar to what you see in Middle Woodland times. And definitely there are linear type mounds in both these areas. So how those ideals spread, that's kind of a topic of debate a little bit, but, there are many archaeologists in the past that, one that comes to mind is Bob Hall, who wrote a famous book called The Archaeology of the Soul. And what his contention was is that you couldn't have had a several thousand year history of mound construction across the mid-continent without that cultural ideal being spread throughout the region and possibly manifesting itself in different types of mound construction. So, even though we know a lot about, who built the mounds, why the mounds were built, what are in the mounds, it's still somewhat of a mystery in some regards to, ideology and, what might have been some of the mechanisms that put some of the mound building into play.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's got to be some continuity between these various sites, even across cultures. But, one question that comes to mind when you mention the geometric mounds that presumably come later and some of the continuities that may exist between them, what about celestial alignments? I know that we, for instance, see that among a lot of the Hopewell sites in the Ohio River Valley. In Wisconsin, do we see the same sort of thing in terms of these sites being constructed in alignment with celestial phenomena, solstices, things along those lines?
Absolutely. And of course, as you know, and might guess that this is a controversial topic with some archaeologists, and William Romaine from Ohio, who does a lot of the research in Ohio on different types of celestial alignments with Hopewell Adena sites, is a good friend of mine, and him and I have had numerous conversations about that. And right now, I'm actually working with a gentleman named Mark Olson, and him and I are about to publish a significant, we like to think it's significant paper that is going to demonstrate exactly how the effigy mound builders actually did align certain types of mounds to primarily winter and summer solstice alignments, and in some cases even equinox alignments. That seems to be a real central theme with a lot of the mounds. And just to give you one example, we have been able to demonstrate on several mound sites around the state of Wisconsin that bear mounds that are shaped like simple bear shapes, are actually mounds that are appear to be walking, if you will, if you imagine the bear on its side with its two legs, and if you imagine that it's walking across the landscape. We have been able to demonstrate that a lot of these mounds are walking along winter solstice alignments. And one way to think about that is, what does a bear do in the winter? A bear hibernates. So winter comes, a bear goes into the ground, and in some cases, if it's a female, obviously it comes out with cubs. So it's also this concept of part of the ideology of earth renewal, earth regeneration, the cyclic nature of the seasons, which is very common in Native American belief systems. So when they're placing certain mounds on the landscape in Wisconsin, they're definitely having those types of alignments and principles in place to demonstrate that in a metaphorical sense.
Kurt, it's almost like there's a living history or something to that nature of the biology of the region that is kind of communicated over time through these mounds, in other words, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And, they're literally recreating their cosmology on the landscape, and this has deep antiquity in some cases, and it also ties into the belief in the path of souls, which is the Milky Way, and how that aligns on the Wisconsin horizon at different times of the year. Most of the effigy mound sites in Wisconsin, especially if they're groupings of mounds, almost all of them primarily face a south by southeast direction. So what we started to do, there's been 170 plus years of mound mapping and mound excavations where, we know where the mounds are, we know what's in the mounds, we know that they're burials, but now we're starting to take a very much more closer look at the actual placement of these mounds on the landscape and what that might mean from not only a geological standpoint, but from a myth and legend standpoint, and going back and looking at the ethnographic record of many different Native American tribes in the Upper Great Lakes, and also looking at it from a believe it or not, a mathematical standpoint, and doing measurements and things with mound groups and seeing what the relationship of mounds are to each other on sites and sites that are adjacent to each other. And we're starting to find some really interesting things that the evidence is in the mounds themselves, and they've always been there, but it's just a different way of maybe thinking outside the box and taking a look at the mounds in a different light, especially now since the mounds are protected and we no longer excavate them.
Absolutely. This stuff is so fascinating. I think exactly what you're calling for there, Kurt, needs to be done. I mean, it sometimes requires a rethinking of things. James, I'm sure, as we get into that discussion of the geology also of the mounds, that some things are probably coming to mind for you also.
Yeah, geologically speaking, can you describe the difference in the geology of the geographic setting between southwest Wisconsin and southeast Wisconsin? Because I know you mentioned the word driftless, and I saw that in some of the literature, but I did not know exactly what that meant, and I'm not familiar with that.
Well, 10 to 12,000 years ago, Wisconsin was primarily covered with three different glacial lobes: the Green Bay lobe, the Wisconsin lobe, and the Lake Superior lobe. And this was the last glacial maximum that occurred in North America that receded, roughly about 10,000 years ago. And these are the glaciers that created the Great Lakes and most of the river systems like the Mississippi and the Wisconsin River in Wisconsin. But the very southwestern corner of the state, from maybe if you're familiar with the state of Wisconsin, if you look at a map, you have Madison, Wisconsin, which is the state capital, pretty much smack dab right in the middle south portion of the state. And then if you go just a little bit northwest of there towards La Crosse, Wisconsin, as you're going towards Minnesota, and then down towards Prairie du Chien, and then down towards northeastern Iowa, that's an area that we primarily refer to as the driftless area. What that means is that during the glacier period, the glacier lobes did not, the Lake Superior and Green Bay lobes did not come down and cover that landscape and bring the glacial debris and till and outwash plains and drumlin fields and things that you see primarily in the southeast and south central part of the state of Wisconsin. So the land was not impacted by the glaciers and pushed down. So you have a lot of rolling hills with exposed rock outcroppings, and there are only 3 lakes in southwestern Wisconsin, whereas the rest of the state has over 15,000 lakes. And what you have is a deep ravine river valleys, and actually some of the best trout fishing rivers in the world, really. And as a result of that, it's a very different landscape from the rest of the state. And it definitely played a role in not only the placement of mounds on the landscape and the ideology behind it by using upper world type mounds like birds and different types of mounds that are shaped like birds and things like that. So they were using these bluff lines, especially along the Mississippi, to build their mound sites. And ironically, right across the Mississippi, in the southwest corner of the state, if you're going into Marquette, Iowa, just across from Prairie du Chien, there is Effigy Mounds National Monument, which is a large national park that preserves over 200 different effigy mounds that are along the Mississippi on the bluff line there. So even though Wisconsin has most of the effigy mounds in the world, Iowa got the national park, but they do a really good job over there of protecting and preserving the mounds and telling the story of what we think the mounds mean. So that's a little bit of the difference between the geography. In south eastern Wisconsin, there are a lot of lakes, rivers, and streams. Rock River, Milwaukee River, as you go towards the Lake Michigan, and a lot of springs. And we know a lot of mound sites are placed near springs, specifically for religious beliefs. In many different Native American cultures, actually believe that springs are sacred and that they're actually doorways to the underworld, where spirits of animals and people can go between the two worlds. So oftentimes you'll see mound sites in the southeastern part of the state built near large spring systems. There was a pocket, if you will, in the glacial period where there was a lake that actually formed there, a massive, what they call Glacial Lake, Wisconsin. So when you're in that flat area around Fort McCoy in that area, that actually is an ancient lake bed, and the soil in that area is quite sandy and quite different than actually other parts of the state. In my neck of the woods in Dodge County, as you go a little bit farther east of there towards Lake Winnebago, we have one of the largest drumlin fields in the world, and over 150 mound sites that were actually preserved on top of those drumlins, because if you know anything about farming, when you get to the top of those glacial drumlin hills, they're very sandy, they're very rocky, and because of the glacial till that was deposited on top of those drumlins underneath the glaciers. So oftentimes when you're driving around that part of the state, you'll see the bottom sides and the lower parts and the bottom sides of the drumlins will be farmed, but not the very tops of them, because the sand and the rocks and stuff are, more prevalent up there. And as a result of that, a lot of the mound sites were preserved in Dodge County because people were not plowing up those top of those drumlins. So in effect, the glacial topography of that area actually helped to save over 100 mound sites in Dodge County alone. So yeah, it's a very unique landscape. And of course, we have the northern and southern Kettle Moraine State Forest, which scientists from all around the world come to study that glacial history.
What do we know about the cultures themselves as far as the people? Now, from my reading, I understand that the modern day Ho-Chunk people lay claim to some of these early effigy builders, but through maybe artifacts, through point types or other type of cultural lithics and things that have been left behind, what do we know about the actual culture itself?
Well, one way to think about the effigy mound builders is our perception of them has been changing a little bit over the last decade or so. Back in the 1960s, there's an archaeologist in Milwaukee Public Museum named Ritzenthaler who coined the term effigy mounds culture. But a better way to think about it is, that word culture always kind of implies a lot of things. It implies that you have uniform burial types, uniform artifact types, uniform mound types, mound shape types, and all these types of things. And what we're finding is that even though it was a pretty cohesive group of people, a better way to think about it was that these were highly nomadic hunter-gatherer people that were practicing a burial ritualism, or a burial cult, if you will, that spread across a wide area. And when you look at the distribution of different types of mound shapes, we can definitely see that there are shamans, if you will, or designers of mound sites in certain parts of the state that are of the same groups of people that are being territorial in those areas for resources and things like that. One thing about effigy mounds, which is different than previous mound building cultures from the early woodland and middle woodland, is that when they started to construct effigy mounds, they virtually put no artifacts as grave offerings in effigy mounds. But in early woodland mound construction and middle woodland mound construction, especially during the Adena Hopewell period, you have elaborate burials where they're putting a lot of exotic trade goods like different types of projectile points, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from out west, sheets of mica from the Carolinas, things like that. So, there are extensive trade networks that flourish over different times of mound building. But when they get to the effigy mound building, for whatever reason, they're not including a lot of grave goods. So from that standpoint, we do know what types of pottery that the late woodland effigy mound people built. We call that Madison ware, and it's a very distinctive type of thin-walled, sand and grit tempered pottery that has very distinctive cord-impressed markings on it. And we do know what our common projectile point types that were common for that period, things like Madison triangular points and things like that are indicative of that time frame. But as far as other types of elaborate types of burial goods and things that really tie it to one known modern Native American group like the Ho-Chunk, that has not been established very well in the archaeological record. But with that said, though, if you look at the ideology of the mound shapes of bears and birds and these animals of the upper and lower world, many of these mound shapes do seem to coincide with the clan symbolism of the Ho-Chunk people, like the Bear Clan, the Thunderbird Clan, the Deer Clan, Water Spirit Clan. And many of that, a lot of that information was recorded by Paul Radin, who was an ethnographer back around the turn of the last century, who went and lived with not only the Wisconsin Winnebago, as they were called back then, but also the Nebraska branch of the Ho-Chunk people. And he recorded a rather lengthy ethnography that talked about their clan systems and their symbolism and their different types of religious ideology, which today we can now attribute to some of those mound shapes.
As we begin to learn more about this connection with the people, it's the individual sites as well that seem to keep coming up in my research. And a few of those I want to discuss with you. The ones that I seen kind of occurring the most seem to be one called Frank's Hill, and then a very unique one known as Mound Park, and then also the Ghost Eagle.
Man Mound, yep.
So out of those three, can you kind of tell us what makes those individual ones so special? And I'm especially interested in the Mound Park because it seems to be so unique.
Yeah, Man Mound in Wisconsin, there during the course of the early to mid 1800s, there were 11 man mounds that were documented in a fairly tight geometric area in Wisconsin, which was up just north of Madison towards the Wisconsin Dells and the Baraboo Hills, and a little bit to the west of there. And unfortunately, the Man Mound in Man Mound Colony Park is the only anthropomorphic effigy mound that remains in the entire world. And this past summer, we celebrated the nomination and acceptance of Man Mound being the United States' most recent National Historic Landmark. And that was a process that was begun by a woman named Dr. Amy Roseborough, who is the Assistant State Archaeologist of Wisconsin, who started the nomination process to get the Man Mound nominated and accepted as a National Historic Landmark last year. And then it was this last summer, back in July, we did the ceremony with the National Park Service and various Native American tribes in the state of Wisconsin to honor that designation. So that is one of only 3 archaeological parks in the state of Wisconsin that have National Historic Landmark significance. The other one is Aztalan State Park, which is a Mississippian cultural site. And the other one is another one that's up by just north of Green Bay that's called the Copper Culture State Park, which documents ancient burials from the early woodland period. So Man Mound is unique. Like I said, it's the only anthropomorphic shaped effigy mound in the world that still exists. And it was first found or rediscovered, if you will, in 1859 by a guy named William Canfield, who was the surveyor of Sauk County, Wisconsin. And he drew a very detailed map of it and actually sent it to Wisconsin's preeminent mound mapper, Increase Lapham. And Lapham helped to preserve that those images of that mound in his book, The Antiquities of Wisconsin as Surveyed and Described. And Increase Lapham was a guy who, if you don't know about him, who was a surveyor who came to the city of Milwaukee in 1836, and he was working for a gentleman named Byron Kilbourne, and he was hired by Byron Kilbourne to literally survey the streets of Milwaukee. And as he was doing that, Lapham was noticing that there were dozens of effigy mounds being destroyed right before his eyes by the development of the city. So what Lapham did was he went to an organization called the American Antiquarian Society, which we know today as the Smithsonian, and he went to them and he said, if you give me $500, I will go around all over the southern third of Wisconsin, and over the course of a couple of years, I will map as many mound sites as I can. So he sets off to do this with his horse named Billy in a cart, and he goes around and he maps dozens and dozens of sites all around the state of Wisconsin. And this book, The Antiquities of Wisconsin, is actually the first book published by the Smithsonian's Contributions to Knowledge, and the first scientific book published in the state of Wisconsin. The other thing that makes Increase Lapham interesting is he was also the state's first geologist, and he wrote a very important early work on Wisconsin state geology. And he is also noted as being the founder or father of the National Weather Service. So his work was extremely important in early mound research, because many of the mound sites that Increased Lapham mapped no longer exist. But because of his work, we know where they were. We know what types of mounds were at those sites and how they were distributed on the landscape. And the Man Mound was one of those that, unfortunately, was partially destroyed on the lower half of its legs, but about 2/3 of it still remain. And it really is a treasure in North America from an archaeological standpoint.
Oh, absolutely. And, first of all, congratulations on that becoming a National Historic Landmark, because we know the protection that provides for these treasures. So, congratulations on that. That's a huge accomplishment. Kind of the last thing we want to really dig into here is a bill early in 2016 that was all over, social media. And I know something that you were very involved with, was sponsored by Senator Chris Kapenga and Representative Robert Brooks. That would allow landowners to investigate Native American effigy mounds to determine whether or not they contain burial remains, and no remains would allow for the site's development. Now, that was back in early 2016. Where are we at with that today? And tell us about your role in all of that.
Well, I'll tell you what my role in it specifically was, and I'll clarify a couple of things that you've already mentioned. I started the Effigy Mounds Initiative Facebook group page back in mid-2015. And when I started that Facebook page, it was really just for fun. I wanted to have a page where anybody and everybody could come and post anything and everything about mounds, whether it was photographs, personal stories, short videos, all those different types of things. And then as the year rolled on, in late 2015, we started to hear rumors that there was an impending attack on the existing Burial Sites Protection Act, which has been in law in Wisconsin since 1986. So it's a law that's been in place for over 30 years, that's been successful. And it stemmed from a singular mound in the city of Madison, Wisconsin, that was going to be destroyed by development back around 1985, 1986. So some local interested peoples that were led by the Ancient Earthworks Society, the Wisconsin Archaeological Society, and many other people banded together and got some legislation put forth that Governor Tommy Thompson at the time signed into law. So when 2016 rolled around early in January of that year, the Wisconsin State Legislature was going into their legislative session, and there was a bill that was proposed by Christopher Kapenga and Robert Brooks that was called AB 620. And make no mistake about this, this was a bill that was aimed to totally dismantle the existing Burial Sites Protection Act. And that not only included ancient effigy mounds and other types of ancient burial mounds, but it also included early historic settler cemeteries that you see in the countryside and cemeteries in general. And what the impetus for that was basically was that there is a corporation in McFarland, which is right next door to Madison, called the Wingra Stone Corporation. And this was owned by an individual that knowingly purchased this land over 30 years ago, actually over 40 years ago, knowing that there was a cataloged burial effigy mound site within this piece of land that he wanted to quarry. So over the last 40 years, they literally quarried this mound site into a pedestal, a 40-foot high pedestal in the middle of a giant stone quarry. And once they got that far, this individual who owns that company wanted to destroy that mound site because he claimed that there were $10 million of gravel mineral under that mound site that he wanted. So he put Christopher Kapenga and Robert Brooks to task to come up with this legislation to dismantle the existing Burial Sites Act for that purpose. So as you can imagine, that did not sit well with a lot of people, including the 12 tribes of Native American folks here in Wisconsin. And so what happened at the time, I was working for the Ho-Chunk Nation as an archaeologist doing various survey work for them. And my Facebook page, unknowingly or unwittingly or whatever, very quickly became a rallying point, if you will, for disseminating information about the progress of that bill. And I kind of took control of leading an effort to oppose that bill and convince the Native American tribes that they needed to oppose it and throw money at it. And we organized a massive rally on the state capitol, which happened in January of 2016, where we had over 3,000 people down at the state capitol, many of them Native Americans from all of the Native American tribes in the Upper Great Lakes, and being led specifically by the Ho-Chunk Nation. And so we let them know that this wasn't going to fly, and started to fight, the progression of that bill. And it very quickly didn't gain very much steam or sponsorship and people signing on to it in that legislative session. But the issue was not going to go away. So what they did was they put it this last year, for almost a year, it was in what's called a legislative study committee, where they decided, and I'm using quotations when I say this, to study the issue. So they had a couple of different tribal historic preservation officers. One of them was Bill Quackenbush from the Ho-Chunk, and a gentleman from the Menominee tribe of Wisconsin. And they also had the individual who was the person who started this bill in the first place, Bob Shea from Wingo Corporation, and a couple of archaeologists that run a panel that over the course of the year studied this issue and were trying to come to some kind of a compromise. And the big debate was, how do you prove that there are actual burials in effigy mounds? Well, of course, the only way that you can prove that is to excavate the mound. But from the Native American standpoint, excavation is desecration. So they were not going to go for that. And so the battle ensued over the course of these last couple of years about the differing points of what that meant. And what ultimately happened was we actually were able to put a new bill through the study committee that actually strengthened the law, which it should have been, and it provided additional buffering to mound sites, and it also had a little bit of a different change in the protocol of how the State Historical Society handles the cataloging of burial sites for landowners, for private landowners. So when Robert Brooks and Christopher Kapenga tried to push this bill, they framed it in a landowner's issues, like a landowner's rights issue. But the problem with that is that, most people know what these mounds are. They know that they're burial mounds. The Native Americans consider them sacred, and any type of ground disturbance is taboo. And but many of the mound sites in Wisconsin were not falling under total protection of the Burial Sites Protection Act, because what you have to do is you have to those mound sites have to be cataloged, and what that means is you have to have a professional archaeologist come out and do a proper survey of the mound site and produce a very specific type of map that shows property boundaries. You have to get landowners' permission to do that, obviously. And you also have to gather any other pertinent information about that mound site that might have been done over the last 175 years, put that in a file, and then that's submitted to the state archaeologist, and then they begin the process of nominating that site for cataloging into the historic registry of historic sites. And the benefit for landowners, let's say you're a landowner and you have an effigy mound group on your property. If you enter into what they term as a covenant with the state of Wisconsin and you agree to preserve those mound sites in your property, they will, the state of Wisconsin will write that land off your property taxes. So there is some incentive for landowners to do this. And so that's basically the gist of it, of what happened. And we're still waiting for final approval of the last bill that came out of the study committee that's actually going to strengthen the law. And we're keeping a very close eye on that. And I can tell you there's a lot of opposition against it in the state of Wisconsin. And so we're keeping our eye on it, and that's basically where it stands right now.
Well, naturally, you want to be able to preserve these Native American heritage sites, and I can understand from the landowner's perspective that they want to be able to do what they can with their land. So I'm glad, from the archaeological perspective, which I think we all here share, that there are certain incentives that will encourage landowners to protect these sites, because I get that could be shaky. But again, I think you made a very salient point in the video that we saw online, and this is available on YouTube. Of course, we'll have this linked on the show notes page at 7ages.org, in which you make the argument, would you want somebody coming along and doing this to your or your own grave, perhaps, hundreds of years from now, let alone your ancestors? I mean, we have to kind of give ourselves a cultural context for that, and I think that you argue the point eloquently. And it's very important that people understand that just in the name of protecting land and what people want to do, I understand that there's that financial incentive ever present there, which is part of the reason we have cultural resource management get involved in things like this when there are sites of historic importance that are uncovered. But I hope that people can, if nothing else, Kurt, maybe be educated about the importance of preservation and also build a sensitivity, I think, over time for the feelings of indigenous cultures and their heritage, which is being put at stake over issues like this. Exactly.
And that was the entire purpose of the Effigy Mounds Initiative group Facebook page, is to educate the public about the importance of this collective cultural heritage and why these sites are important, not only for Euro-Americans, but for everybody. And just the fact that they're nowhere else in the world, there's such a unique cultural phenomenon of these mounds being constructed here. And 3,200 sounds like a lot, but it really isn't compared to the massive amounts of that there used to be. And so we don't need to dig the mounds anymore. We know what's in them. We know what they're about, that they're burials. And again, like I tried to illustrate in that video that you spoke about, it really just comes down to education and cultural empathy, and the very fact that who are we to say that Native American graves are not any more important than the millions of Euro-American graves that are dot the landscape in every state, and they all need to be protected with equal protections and equal care. So that's my standpoint anyway. That's my belief, and I think that's the belief of a lot of people that are here in Wisconsin, and so that's what we fight for. And I got involved with mound site issues, believe it or not, as early as the 4th and 5th grade, when I was first taken to an effigy mound site called Lizard Mound, which is right north of my hometown in Cedarburg, just north of Milwaukee. And believe it or not, years ago, the Milwaukee Public Museum had excavated a mound site, and they did this with the expressed purpose of finding an intact burial in an effigy mound that they wanted to expose. And they did this, and they built a cement retaining wall around the exposed burial in the heart of the mound and put a piece of plexiglass over the top of it. So you could actually walk right up to the edge of this mound and look down in it and actually see the actual burial. And when I was in 4th grade and saw that had a profound effect on me at that time. And of course, at that time, our teacher was using that as an educational tool to say, well, maybe this isn't the best thing to do, and eventually, the Native Americans were obviously very upset about this. And, but believe it or not, that actual exhibit stood like that for over 20 years. Then finally, enough people raised enough stink about it that they dismantled it and covered the grave back up, and we no longer do those types of things. But yeah, that was just kind of the attitude back in the 70s and 60s, and when I was a kid, and of course, times have changed. So
Yeah.
And we're hoping to, continue to educate. And one of the big things that we do now that you might have noticed on the Effigy Mounds initiative is there are a group of people that are not only professional archaeologists, but avocational archaeologists and concerned citizens and people that are interested in natural resources and things like that. And we have formed a loose coalition, if you will, of people that where we're going around the state and we're doing care projects on effigy mound sites and reclaiming them, so to speak, where many of the mound sites around the state have been overtaken by vegetation, invasive vegetation like buckthorn and things like that. So what I've been doing with a handful of people is we've been going around the state and cleaning up mound sites, taking the invasive vegetation off them, cutting big trees off the mounds, which damage them in the long run, and basically reclaiming them from being overrun with vegetation. And some of these are in county parks, some of these are on private property, and so we're working with private and non-private entities to educate people how to care for the mound sites for the long run. And the most recent one we're working on is in my neck of the woods up in Dodge County, called the Nitschke Mounds County Park, which is a county park that preserves 26 effigy mounds that over the last 12 years we've got about 75% of the site cleaned up and the vegetation off the mounds. So it's also this push to care for the mound sites for the long term as well. Most of the southern third of Wisconsin in early historic times was a giant oak savanna prairie. Well, that type of vegetation and landscape has kind of changed over the last 175 years, but many of these mound sites that still exist in those types of oak savanna prairie settings. So we're restoring the native vegetation and savanna type vegetation to those areas that we can. And so that's been going on for probably about maybe 15 years or so.
Wow. Well, it sounds like it's really good work you're doing up there, and the kind of place that we here at Seven Ages would like to visit. As a quick postscript, Kurt, I'd just like to ask you too, in relation to the man mound, and this being presumably the only man-shaped mound still in existence in North America, just as a kind of an afterthought, do you have any general thoughts about that in relation to similar effigies, maybe not mound structures or earthworks, but we do have similar representations of humans in other places. Do you have any general thoughts about those kind of things, whether or not there's actually any kind of continuity that can be made since they're in other parts of the world?
Well, I don't think that there's any cultural affiliation between the different types of man mounds, personally, from the evidence that I've seen.
Right.
I think that the ones that you see in England and the ones that you see in South America, whether it's the Nazca lines or the one you mentioned in Europe and the ones that are in North America, I think that it is entirely cultural specific from what I've seen. There's many different theories about what the man mound in North America means. I have my own idea based on my research of what I think it means. I believe that if you look at the man mound from purely an ideological standpoint from the beliefs of the Ho-Chunk people, they actually talk about these walking water spirits. And oftentimes you have effigy mounds that are shaped like these panther mounds on the ground that have the similar horn configuration on the head that the man mound does. Mm-hmm. And in the Ho-Chunk language, they actually have specific Ho-Chunk words that describe walking water spirits, and in particular panther mounds that transform themselves into walking water spirits. So personally, that's what I believe the man mound in Wisconsin is supposed to represent. You also see this depicted in petroglyph and petroglyph form and different types of rock art and things of that nature. There are some examples of it up in Canada and in the American Southwest and out in the Rockies and stuff. So it is entirely possible that they all have a similar meaning, especially in North America, and they're meant to be depicting some type of, possible mythological being or something like that. But,
Right.
But it's like anything, and you know how this goes. You get 5 different archaeologists together, and you put an artifact in front of them, and you're going to get 5 different opinions about, what that means.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of different ideas about it. Some people think it's just a shaman with a buffalo headdress on its head. Some people think it's this cultural hero of the Algonquin culture. It definitely is a cross-cultural thing, and you see it depicted, and they probably have a similar idea in mind about why they're depicting this particular image, but who knows?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that's great about the mounds. For as much as we think we know about them, there's a lot that we don't know, and that history or that mystery aspect of it is something that actually definitely keeps me going and interested in it, and not only with mounds, but all sorts of things,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, man. And I certainly hope that people who hear this, whether you live in Wisconsin and you hear about the kinds of initiatives that are underway right now with the Effigy Mounds initiative and the work for restoration and also preservation and getting the word out to people, I hope that people from all parts of North America will hear this and that they will feel the same and want to get involved. And if they do, tell us how they can get in touch with you, Kurt, or how they can learn more about the Effigy Mounds initiative and the other work that you do.
Well, you can certainly visit the Effigy Mounds Initiative Facebook page. If you like, I can give you my contact information right on the air here, whatever, if you like.
If you're comfortable with it, we are.
Sure. People can call me at this number at 414-405-4367. That's 414-405-4367. And then my email is just my name. It's Kurtz with a K, K-U-R-T, and then Sampson, S-A-M-P-S-O-N. The number 68 at gmail.com. So Kurt Sampson 68 at gmail.com. People are more than welcome to call me anytime or drop me an email. And if they have any questions, or if they would like some information or information about ongoing work on mound sites in the state of Wisconsin, and it's not just in Dodge County, it's in actually there are several ongoing projects around the state that we're involved with, southwest part of the state, central part of the state, northeast part of the state. So if people are interested and want to get involved, keep checking the Facebook page as well, because we also post our events on there when there are cleanup days or lectures or whatever we might be doing that's mound related.
Absolutely. Hey, we want to thank you for being on 7 Ages Audio Journal. We're all fascinated by this stuff, and we're all a group of, my comrades here, Jason has a background in environmental science. James, of course, is a professional geologist. I'm just an avocationalist and a researcher, but man, you spend a significant amount of time studying this stuff, and you are just enthralled with it. It draws you in. And I know you know exactly what we're talking about, Kurt. So thank you so much for spending time with us. This is so great to get your perspectives on all of it. It's just incredible stuff. Protecting Dodge County history and all parts of Wisconsin. Kurt Sampson, thanks again, man.
Thanks, guys. Nice talking to you.
And thanks again to Kurt Sampson for coming on the show. What a great interview. I guess we're getting down to the end of this thing, guys. Do you guys want to talk about maybe what we've got coming up on 008?
Yeah, a lot to look forward to. I see that Jason has updated our parchment pad here, and that we have some discussion of one of our favorite physicists, Mr. William R. Corliss. We're all fans of Corliss, and for those who aren't familiar with him and his work, he was not only a physicist, and he had written a lot of books as it relates to everything from aerospace and the future to technology, but as his kind of pastime hobby, he collected information from almost always an explicitly scientific source material as it related to anomalous phenomena in nature, whether it was geophysical phenomena, illuminations and things like ball lightning. He also looked at biological mysteries, he talked a lot about archaeology, and some of his archaeological and geological source books, I mean, they are required reading, I think, for people who enjoy Seven Ages, and certainly for the team members here. We all own a lot of different ones. Let's really quickly, maybe in advance of that, let's just talk about our favorite core list books. It's hard to pick one. The Archaeological Anomalies Small Artifacts book is great, but I've also got such an affinity for the old stuff, guys. That old 1978 edition, it's 400 plus pages thick, but it's Ancient Man, a handbook of puzzling artifacts. That's got to be my favorite.
Yeah, that's quite a tome. I think my favorite is obviously probably the Geologic Anomalies.
Oh, of course, that's a great one. Jason?
Actually, the one I'm currently reading that's my favorite is called Carolina Bays, Mima Mounds, Submarine Canyons, and Other Topographical Phenomenon. It's part of the geological series, but great book. Also, I just got in, speaking of which, yesterday, the tome, which is Ancient Man, a handbook of puzzling artifacts. It is quite a large book, and I got to say I'm excited. It's right on top of the ever-growing stack of books here on my desk, but man, these core list books are great. They're encyclopedic in the way that they're built, and it's just a fantastic catalog of information. So it's not like sitting down and reading a typical book. You can just grab little snippets of stuff and carry it around with you and think about it all day. That's what I really like about them.
I just got to say, too, I didn't know that you'd gotten Ancient Man. It's a little dated, but I mean, it's still such a great wealth of information. And again, Corliss, rather than focusing on sensational stuff, you're not going to see like ancient aliens and ridiculous stuff in his books. He's talking about, for instance, structural anomalies. For instance, how was this structure built, and what technology could account for it in the ancient past. He'll look at artifacts. Occasionally, he'll look at things like out-of-place artifacts, but he doesn't go like down the ridiculous rabbit hole. A lot of these kinds of so-called out-of-place artifacts can be easily explained as natural concretions and other kinds of geological formations. We're going to get in depth into that on the next episode, but it's really cool to see, Jason, that you got a copy of that. And again, eventually it's my goal to be able to have all the Corliss books. Problem is, some of them are very rare, and hence they're very expensive. So a lot to wade into. What else have we got to look forward to on the next episode?
How about some history of rock and roll?
Yeah. That's going to be fun, too. A new segment we'll be introducing. We may also get a guest on at some point to discuss some field work with us. So one of our many friends that we've met during our travels. And then also I understand, of course, we've got some updates on the EPA.
And we're also going to talk about some ancient archaeological tattooing practices.
Oh, that's always very interesting to me. We had recently said while we were in the field, what would the ancient Clovis hunters have looked like? Jason, I think you're the one that said, what if they were all just covered in tattoos and things like this? So we're going to look into the ancient practices of tattoo amidst various cultures. And, you don't have to actually get tattoos in order to be able to celebrate the pictorial references that we make here on Seven Ages. You can head over to Instagram and see plenty of pictures of us as we were working in the field. We also put up updates on Twitter and on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook. 7 Ages Research is typically the handle you want to look for. And, of course, all things 7 Ages are available at our website, 7ages.org. We'll have some new articles up in the next few days and other information about our endeavors, where we're going to be going, where we'll hope to see you out there in the field. info@7ages.org is the email. And you can also, of course, as said earlier, email Jason, James, or I, just using our names, Jason, James, or Micah at 7ages.org. That'll wrap it up for this week's edition of the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Always our pleasure to be here in pocket with you guys, and we will see you in the future, or maybe the past.